Welcome everybody to our TRC 57 speaker series, Learning with Syeyutsus. My name is Ted Cadwallader. I'm co-host with my two friends, Tom Quatten and Squishelton Tanat, Lawrence Mitchell and Stephanie Johnson. We're pleased you could join us today in our fourth season. We're happy to introduce our guest here in a moment. I wanted to let you know again that this series is part of Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools' efforts to bring Call to Action 57 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action to life. And we've had a series of authors provided to us by our partners at UBC Press, and we're pleased to be working this year with the Vancouver Island Regional Libraries. So if you're in a watch party or part of the Vancouver Island Regional Libraries, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you VIRL for being a great partner. Following our protocols on this territory, the Hul'qumi'num speaking territories on the west coast of what's now called Canada, we'll turn it over to our brother Tom Quatten to welcome us to these territories.
Right, the Swamnik, Atana Quail, Limu, East, Tanashqualo, and Quasi keep at Wallop, Fight App, Nastlik, when I see it, the CM Swakwa, Shalene, Taichka, Mihui, will to Satakat, and Squiem, Eat, and Squall. Thank you, each and every one of you, for being here and acknowledging our dear friend Shalene for coming forward and sharing her goodness and her stories with us. And tat iwi eat them tanakwale. I will share a blessing over the work and sing a song. Heights up, heights up. Hat CM nawat imashtuch tamak dem tanakwale eat the mak squale. Heichka at a house squale. Heichka neat ali. Heichka at a nashwal quatitl namet at a quail. Neat ham at quimet at nawa. Almost at qualaman. It's a wet talk and swal qua. Equam quam stuch to squalaman. And through total at the matsi eyes titl namet. Equam latmamit. Hana heatless swalaqua. Equami fahant. Hana swalaqua sanu at the kaki out. Haichka what tana tama. The tanaquel, the maxquel. Nawa squampums at the sleets. Haichka. Me halital.
Shayel, what a great start to our sessions, to be welcome to this territory, and ancestors and descendants come around. We are very pleased today to welcome Dr. Shalene Wuttunee Jobin. She's a Cree and Métis scholar, citizen of Red Pheasant Cree Nation. And I was talking before and I noticed that her biography has changed. So she's moved from where her biography says in her book. She's at University of Alberta right now, but she's here to talk about something that's quite curious at the moment. It's her book, Upholding Indigenous Economic Relations, Νehiyawak Narratives. I hope I said that Cree phrase properly. And economics and economy and capitalism and ways of being in the world that are more reciprocal. So Shalene, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll ask our guests or who are in the audience to chip in the chat if there's any questions that they might have for you along the way. But I've certainly got some questions. But thank you, first of all, off the top, with gratitude, for writing such a beautiful book about economics, of all things. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ted. Do you see the right version of my slide deck?
I'm moving my video there. Yes, I do.
Okay, perfect. Danse Shalene Jobin Nitzigasun, Loretta Wuttunee Nigawi Nehiyawak Utsi Red Pheasant, Fred Jobin Pam Notui Apitogasen Utsi Big Prairie, Nia Shalene Wuttunee Jobin. I'm really honored to be here today, and so I introduced myself and upsis a little bit of the Cree language, and just said that my mother is Loretta Wuttunee, and we're members and citizens of Red Pheasant Cree First Nation in Treaty 6 in Saskatchewan, and my late father was Métis from Northern Alberta, Treaty 8 territory. And yeah, I am in Amiskwichi-Muskinahaygan. Beaver Hills House, are now known as Edmonton, and just really, really honored that you took the time to be here today, all of you, and also that for those who have started reading the book, just really honored that you have done that. Chapter 1 is a really easy read, and then chapter 2 and 3 are kind of more of the academic read, and then it gets to a lot more stories. So I just wanted to take some time to begin to just kind of go through some of my thinking in this book, and then we'll have time for conversations after. A year and a half ago, I lived outside of Edmonton, and this was my backyard. And it was so fun. It was just the beginning. In Alberta, we have these long winters, and so I was outside, and oh no, I was writing in my room looking outside, and there was probably 50 to 70 swallows that decided to have a party in the trees behind the house. And so I opened the window, and they were chattering and having fun, and I thought, oh, this is so interesting. And I hold a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous governance at the University of Alberta, and one of the things that I love to learn about is governance. And so, you know, some people say governance is the process where societies make decisions and how they decide how to make those decisions. And for me, when I look around our world, I think, what isn't governance? So how I see governance and how the swallows I watched were interacting in those trees. And Indigenous peoples learn from many different resources, and one is how animals govern themselves. And I actually was talking to an elder and knowledge holder this morning, and she was talking about this, and with bears, and one of the elders I interviewed in the book, his name is Sunny, and he called this Kiskinawapamowin, learning through observation. other authors, Tasha Hubbard is a filmmaker, and she has a film coming out that just came out this month and last month. And she talks about how Buffalo are matriarchal societies and kind of the governance of that. And so, yeah, those are really things that I love learning about. And as was mentioned, this is the book that I wrote. It came out last year, and it started in probably the year 2000. I was doing in high school, actually. So in the 90s, my grandmother, Shalene Wuttunee, she was living at our house, and my aunt, Elsie Wuttunee, and I were talking, and I was wondering what I should do after high school. And she said, you should go into business because we need more Indigenous women in business. And I didn't know really what a business degree meant, but I listened to her, and she was a mentor to me. So I went into business, and in my last year of university, I took a class from a professor in Indigenous studies, and it was called The Culture of Capitalism. And so it just really was the first time in my university undergrad, I got to think critically about capitalism. And so it left me with all these classes, or all these thinking about the different classes I took about business and this culture of capitalism that we live in oftentimes as our main economic system. And so then I worked for a few years and then did a master's of Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria, and fell in love with Vancouver Island. I thought I was gonna live there after, and then I got pulled back home. But then in my master's, the first paper I wrote was sort of, at that time, it was 2003, we were kind of talking about that if Indigenous communities wanted, and Indigenous nations wanted self-determination, then kind of what society was saying is that in our own communities that we had to be economically independent of the federal government. And so kind of the idea there was, if whoever controls the purse strings has the control. And so and so then I got to thinking about how capitalism has different governance implications that follow through with it in terms of different economic development, opening lands up for resource development, and thinking about that sort of approach. And so then started working at the Faculty of Native Studies in 2007, and then 2009, I started a PhD program in political science and Indigenous studies. And so this was kind of the research I did over my PhD. And one of the things that I found is how colonial control of Indigenous peoples in settler societies like Canada have often taken this two-pronged approach. So on the one hand is bureaucratic control or state domination. So we can think of the Indian Act and all the ways that different people have talked about how First Nations bodies and communities are controlled from cradle to grave. And obviously there's changes in the Indian Act, but it's still in place today. We can think of the Indian residential school system and all the implications of control that happen through that and those impacts. We also have an example of the pass system that I talk about in the book, and this was definitely in place in my community, Red Pheasant, and other communities where you needed a physical pass to leave the reserve. And so you had to go to the Indian agent, ask for a pass, and they would ask what you were needing it for, and they could choose whether to give it to you or not. And then to not be apprehended or, let's say, go to jail, you had to carry around this pass that the Indian agent gave you. Some people might not know that actually South Africa, during the pass system in Canada, their representatives and government officials came to Canada, learned about the pass system in Canada for First Nations, and then they implemented it in South Africa as part of their apartheid system. And so we can think of those sorts of aspects of bureaucratic control, state domination. And so when we think about that, one natural response is that we have to get out of that bureaucratic control. But we often our answer is economic development, and different state governments has said yes, economic development, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But one of the things that I thought was really important to look at in this book is how one of the most enduring aspects of settler colonialism on this land has been economic exploitation. And I felt like we haven't talked about the economic exploitation part of settler colonialism enough. And so that was something I really wanted to unpack, and how it operates in different aspects of Canada is different. And so I focused on Treaty 6 lands in Alberta and Saskatchewan as kind of my lens in this book. But that idea of economic exploitation is something that happened throughout Canada and can still happen in different ways in terms of different development projects that happen where Indigenous peoples aren't in the driver's seat. They aren't in control of what happens on their lands. And so it's something important that I thought we should talk more about. And so then kind of for any of you that are interested in research or are thinking about different research projects, one of the aspects that Renee Boisselé-Macbeth and I, she just defended her PhD on Monday and now is a doctor. And so we were going to a community presentation and driving down Highway 2 from Edmonton to Red Deer, and talking about Indigenous legal orders and doing this presentation for that, for a community. And we wanted to talk about these research concepts, but in really ways that made sense. And so one of the concepts that people talk about is ontology. And so we use the metaphor of a tree to talk about the root system of the tree as the worldview, and how Indigenous worldviews can be seen in this metaphor as that root system, and how the trunk of the system in research we call that epistemology, but that trunk of the tree could be Indigenous systems of knowledge, and how that comes from our worldview, our root systems. And then the different branches of the tree are the methodologies that we choose to use in different research. And then the leaves of the trees are those different methods. And for me, I used stories as one key method. And then in terms of the methodology, I used what I called a nehiyawak peoplehood methodology. And so this is Cree syllabics. And so part of the process was me taking a class and learning from an elder about Cree syllabics and the teachings in them. And so the syllabics in the north is the Cree language, and in the east is Cree lands, territory, and the south is different the ceremonial cycle of the nehiyawak, the Plains Cree people, and in the west is a Chimowena stories, and so I tried to use in the book our language, our interacting with the land and developing those relationships with Treaty 6 territory, thinking through the ceremonial cycle and participating in that, and also learning from the past in terms of our stories and my own family and community, and more broadly Plains Cree stories, and sharing that also with the future. And so thinking through how that works. And so what I did is I read over 160 Cree stories, and some of these could be sacred stories, legends, creation stories, historical accounts, personal stories. And then I found 35 related to Cree economic relations. And then over a year period, I would read them over in different iterations. And then I use the traditional software in Vivo, and that's just a little joke. It's not Cree software or anything, but I thought it was really neat. I love these different tools that we can use. So I scanned these 35 written stories and into a PDF format, and then put it into in Vivo. And then I would read over and code the different parts of the story that had to do with different economic relationships. And then I repeated this process over and over, and then assigned different categories related to different types of economic relationships. So relationships between, let's say, a person and a tree, or an economic relationship that was developed with that, perhaps between a Cree person and a person of a different Indigenous nation, or different trade was coded in that way. And so through that process, there was 104 different, what they call in the software, nodes. And then that kind of broadened up to 10 big categories. So then this is a screenshot, and it kind of shows, it's really small. Oh, it's generosity. And so in this example of generosity, there was 7 different stories that were related to this principle. And so then I could pull out those different stories, and it would scan and have highlighted those aspects of the stories that had to do with generosity. And I'm a visual learner, and so then it would also pop out these different parent nodes and relationships with child nodes, is what they call it in grounded theory. And so then I could see how everything was related to each other in these different ways. And so chapters 5 and 6 explain some of the results of this analysis. And then one of the things that I found is how how economic relationships for Plains Cree people in this example often had to do with whether they were establishing a relationship, maintaining a relationship, dealing with an opposing relationship. And so one of the learnings is often when we talk about relationships and relationality, we only want to focus on the good stories, having good relationships. But it's also important to say that not all relationships at all times are in that good category. And there's a whole wealth of information on how to think through relationships that are tense or opposing, and different principles that can be applied in those situations, like in also that category of restoring relationships. And a lot of the economic development readings around Indigenous economic development is about a certain type of economic development that kind of follows what capitalism is doing. And I saw a gap in the literature when I was thinking about this 20 years ago and 10 years ago, that there's also our own worldview and ways of thinking about the economy. All societies have different aspects of society and thinking about livelihood and economy. And so pulling from thinking about the economy broadly, not just in terms of capitalism, but in terms of how we provide livelihood for ourselves, for our families, for our communities. And in that, we can think about the relationships between one nation, let's say Cree people, and other Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people, other beings, whether those be plants or other living beings in the world, and also spirit beings, and how there's all these learnings from our own ontologies that can speak to these different relationships. And so I did that, and then I went to Cree knowledge holders. So I took what I had learned from the stories, and one thing that we can talk about in terms of research and going and developing relationships and partnerships with Indigenous communities is how often it's best not to come empty-handed. And so to do that homework beforehand, before asking a knowledge holder. And so I was able to present what I had found and ask advice, including what cultural or ceremonial knowledge should be shared within the work, what shouldn't be shared. Also thinking through presenting the principles I found within the stories and asking if they felt like this was their understanding as well, and what did I miss? And then how was it perhaps these principles still happening today or not? And so also used a visiting method, so visiting with different knowledge holders or elders in Treaty 6 in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then asking them who else I should talk to. So then this is my theoretical framework for the book. And so thinking through ಪಿᒫᑎಸಿwin, a livelihood economy, and what that would look like. And so my grandmother, Lillian Wuttunee, she made this ring that I'm wearing today, I think in the 70s. And so she was into making jewelry, and she learned how to make rings out of silver and turquoise. And so yeah, I thought it was important to embody kind of some of those teachings from my own family line into this work. And she was also a beader, my Lillian, my Nokam. And so she lived with me when I was in high school, and I would watch her bead, but that learning through observation. I never asked her to teach me to bead, but I would observe her. And so I have a container of her beads. And so when I was thinking about what the theoretical framework for the book would be, I spent about a year trying to figure that out. And then I was learning how to bead at that point in my life. And so I thought I would use her beads and bead this theoretical framework. So these are some of Lillian's beads that she had. And it was fun because they were in little pill boxes, and I could feel like I was able to remember and interact with her through that process. And so this is a wild rose, which has our own understandings in Cree, and is a rose that's found in Plains Cree territory, and has our own teachings within a Cree worldview. And so in the center are beads that are represent spirit beings, land, water, air beings, different different Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. The different petals represent one of the elders that I worked with, Elmer Ghostkeeper, talked about how all societies have different aspects. And so the 5 petals represent the economic sphere, the cultural sphere, the social sphere, the political sphere, and the legal sphere. And then the leaves represent the peoplehood model that I draw from Tom Home and others, that for Indigenous peoples that live in settler societies, it's important to always maintain our relationship with our territories, our living histories, so our stories, our ceremonial cycles, and our Indigenous language. So, and then this was beaded. I beaded this on hide that we created in a land camp that I was involved in outside of Assiniboine Nation. We brought students, and the kokums, the grandmothers, taught the students how to traditionally tan hide. And so I were able to make this hide that I have a small piece. And so I beaded this onto the hide. And so and these earrings were from one of the students who learned hide tanning through this and other ways. And so just a way to show some of the cool ways that we're still able to show the principles, like what I found through this work, in a contemporary setting. So within a livelihood model, we acknowledge that all elements that I just talked about are interconnected and interdependent, and that all my relations is a common Cree term that really has resonance, that we are related to everything around us. My aunt Laura Comwind, who is an aunt by marriage, she taught me that, and she's an Anishinaabe, and she said our first treaty is with the trees, how we breathe in oxygen from the trees and we breathe out carbon dioxide, which they then take, and then they give us back oxygen. And she said that treaty can never be broken. And so you can see in that example how that relationality, those relationships are so important. And it's relationships to all of our relations. One of the things that I thought was neat to think about when I was working on this is how before the reserve system was put into place for First Nations, we had our own jurisdiction and our own overlapping jurisdictions and different processes and protocols. And so this is a map of Treaty 6 territory, and the Wuttunee family were part of the historical River Cree people group and kind of by Eagle Hills. And so also wanted to represent the Parklands people, the House Cree, and the Beaver Hills Cree, which is in and around the Edmonton area, and how we had our own regional governance systems, as well as we would come together in the summertime and have a larger governance system with the 4 different people groups of Plains Cree. And this is just the upper aspect of Plains Cree. And so, yeah, it was just neat for me and my generation. I've only grown up knowing the reserve system, but just not too long ago, my great-grandfather was born in 1892, his parents would have known this sort of system of governance, and how and if you're joining from the West Coast, you have such a rich understanding of West Coast governance systems and those legal orders and the jurisdiction, and so this is just one example from a Plains Cree perspective, and Fine Day, who was a war chief, he drew this picture from above, so a bird's eye view, or if they had drones in that time, maybe this is a drone's eye view, but a bird's eye view of governance of a Plains Cree camp in 1870. And so he gives the example in the Northeast of the river people and how many teepees they had. I think it's 500 teepees in the drawing. And this was an actual camp in 1870. The Prairie people in this specific encampment, there was, I think it's 300 teepees. The West people, there were 600, and the House people, I can't see it. It's so small in this. But what's cool about it is that then they had their different policing societies, each of the regional groupings, and then their and where the TP was set up was based on your role and responsibility in society. And then there was the policing societies, and then there was also the different chiefs of the different regional groupings. And then there was a head Ogamau, a head leader that was appointed in kind of a situational leadership kind of idea for the encampment. And so in this example, it was Sweetgrass was the chief of all of the regional groupings for this governance system, an example. And so just to talk about these rich histories of these different aspects of societies that we have, and that these encampments still happen in the summer on Treaty 6 territory. And then also how there was this really robust trade language through sign language for Indigenous peoples. And so I talk about this sign language, and people still know the sign language. This is the sign for trade. And just to talk about how throughout, you know, from the Ulican Trail in the west and the Rocky Mountains and to the West Coast that Ted and I were talking about a little bit, to all the way from Amiskuchi Maskanahay again, all the way south to Mexico are these trade routes, all the way east, and then internation across the ocean, all these histories of these trade systems and how we would trade different elements and and it's not just trade goods like earrings or like food or different things, also ceremonies, also songs, and all the protocols and ways of thinking about trade. And all of those knowledges we can draw from when we're thinking about renewing our economic systems in our nations today, that we have these abilities to reinvigorate our trade systems, our internation trade systems. And then I also talk about this concept of colonial dissonance. So Sunny talked to me about cognitive dissonance and how he said that he's a lodge holder, and so he would hold, let's say, different lodges like the sweat ceremony, and he'd have what he would call traditional Indians coming to do a sweat lodge ceremony and talking about these relationships they had with the land and how their job to put food on the table for themselves and their family was, in Alberta, for example, in the oil and gas industry, and how this caused a cognitive dissonance, this dissonance intellectually and mentally, that the values they had of being in relationship with Mother Earth were in tension with their lived daily needs to provide food on the table. And so when I was talking to Sunny, it made me think of, for Indigenous peoples, it's not just a cognitive dissonance, it's also a spiritual dissonance, a physical dissonance on our bodies, an emotional dissonance, and that mental dissonance. And how it's not just economic, although it is that, it's also political, legal, social, and cultural, that with colonialism, it has caused ruptures in all of our relationships based on our values and principles, creating this tension, internal conflict, instability, discord, mistrust, and that we kind of have a perpetual lived state of colonial dissonance in our lives. And so that can seem like a really difficult place to be in. But I think it can also be a creative place. And I got this from, if anyone has ever heard of U2 before, and Bono. I was listening to an interview just one day, and Bono just randomly said, "In the dissonance, that is a creative place." And I thought, wow, how great is it that we can think of all the negative aspects of colonialism and settler colonialism, but we can also think of it as a place of inherent creativity, a place to do beautiful things and creative things that show all the strength and resilience that we still have. And so that, I think, is a really exciting place to think through. And it doesn't negate the difficulty, but for me, it's like colonial dissonance. It would be like a wound, and how the idea of these different resurgent practices and principles can be like a salve on that wound. So, you know, I'm taking a Cree language class, and I've probably taken 6 or 7, but I'm still learning. And taking that class and speaking the words, introducing myself in nehiyawak, even though I'm just a piece of a learner and a speaker, that is a salve on the wound of colonial dissonance. And these different practices and principles that we can learn about are really ways to help our colonial dissonance and help heal our soul and our spirit and the ways we embody ourselves in the world. And so one of the chapters in the book, I talk about some of these principles that came out of the stories and came out of the interviews with the different elders. Things like thinking about all civility, showing respect to all of creation, learning through observations, different protocols and proper procedures, natural and forced consequences, gift giving, and how we're all related and relatives, and thinking about, you know, that first treaty with the tree, that there's a symbiosis that Sunny talks about, and so we have to be aware of all those relationships. And the cool thing about principles is that those principles can, although they were applied in a different way 200 years ago or 150 years ago, those principles can still be applied today, and it'll look different, but they still have application. And that is another salve on that wound of how we can uphold our Indigenous teachings and our own worldviews in a really contemporary way. So again, Sunny talked about giskinawapamowin, learning through observations. So throughout the stories, I heard the principles of Cree society adapting, learning new things, trading for new items or technologies, exchanging medicines and ceremonies with others. And there's certain protocols that we can still apply today and are still in place about how to do this in a good way, how new information is gathered and from where, how we gift those that we get the information from, how we cite those through our stories or songs or through my reference list, and how we do this all in a good way. And in terms of different practices, this is a picture from the On the Land course we did. I think this was now 2017 in Assiniboine Nation, where we were taught by the kokums, the elders, the grandmothers about how to tan hide in a traditional way. And the students, they're learning with each other, they're learning and sharing what they've learned in the books with the community, and we had junior high students from the community there as well. And it was just such a fun time. At a place where at Syeyutsus Creek, where they historically did this work and have continued to do this work of tan hiding. And one of the things I did in 2017 is we were asked to bring together 20 Indigenous scholars, and the government, the provincial government, wanted to develop an Indigenous learning framework for how to teach their employees about Indigenous learning. And so those two little graphics at the bottom are some of the learnings that we had from this. And so you can see the spiral, and the spiral is in different colors. And so that represents what Elmer Ghostkeeper taught us about all the different aspects of the society: economic, cultural, legal, political, social, and how part of the learning, like a spiral, is deconstructing the ways that that perhaps as a non-Indigenous person, you might have learned about Indigenous people in different ways, maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 10 years ago, and deconstructing that learning, but then going the other way, reconstructing that learning based on Indigenous people's own knowledges and own gift of sharing their learnings with you. And so that's part of it. And then the other part of it is this graphic beside, how within universities, and I'm a professor, so I know this, we're really good at cognitive learning, that brain learning, learning facts, memorizing dates. But in Indigenous learning, there's all these other ways to learn that are so important. There's relational learning, actually having relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. There's empathetic learning. And if you ever did the blanket exercise, that would be an example of empathetic learning, where it goes from the head to the heart. Or if you were at any of the TRC information gathering events and you heard stories from residential school survivors, that is that heart learning where you really can develop empathy for what people have gone through and are still going through. But it doesn't end there. There is also the importance of that applied learning. So practice. And so within your own sphere of influence and being reflective on what is your sphere of influence, what makes sense, how do you take the cognitive learning, the relational learning, the empathetic learning, do something about it. You know, maybe it's as simple as having conversations over Thanksgiving dinner about about different perspectives on the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Perhaps you are a deputy minister in a government and you have the ability to change your strategic planning by listening to Indigenous peoples and communities, nations in your territory, and really and thinking and understanding from them what are those needs that your government ministry can respond to. So and then it's you can see the sphere by looking this way, and then if you took that bird's eye view, that's the sphere looking down. And so we created this little a table, and so there's the horizontal piece, and then there's the vertical piece. And so let's say your learning journey is right there in the center. And so that is when you're thinking about your learning journey, what are those ways to focus on those cognitive learning, that relational learning, that empathetic learning, and that applied learning? And then your learning journey will go out as you learn more, but it's a whole journey. It's not something that just happens once. And then we also had on that idea roles and responsibilities. So if your roles and responsibilities is the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, your role and responsibility is at a 10. So your learning journey better be at a 10 too. So there's a lot of learning to do. And we all start in for non-Indigenous people, you start in that center and then think about what your learning journey is, and you know, taking the time out of your day to do this is part of your learning journey. And so in my language, there's different principles of engagement. We can think of pimâtisiwin, the governance of all relationships, miyo pimâtisiwin, the good life, how we can think of resurgence, those daily acts of putting that salve on the wound of settler colonialism, whether it's learning our language, going berry picking, reinvigorating trade on our territories, how to have miyo wachitawin, those good relationships, but all about how all of us on these lands can have miyo pimâtisiwin, the good life. That when allowing newcomers to come to these territories and being in these relationships isn't the good life for one at the expense of the good life for the other, that there is a way forward where we can all have this miyo pimâtisiwin. Thank you.
Wow. A way forward that we can all have a good life together. That aligns so much, Dr. Shalene, with many of the guests that we've had on, that there is a way forward being here together. It just takes a different way of thinking. One of the things that you mentioned in there, the colonial dissonance, and how that causes, yeah, it's just hard to manage. And some of our relatives in here on the West Coast, our Snuneymuxw relatives, have developed what they've called a longhouse learning and healing framework. And it's just a path forward rather than thinking through that pathological lens, is a reconnection with land, a reconnection with language, a reconnection with self, and understanding who you are as an Indigenous person in your own territory. Being a visitor in this territory, lived here for 50 years in Tsiiminnis and Hul'qumi'num speaking territories, I found that really helpful, because there's always been that dissonance, right? I worked in government and in school districts for most of my professional career, and found that the pace there, much like you've experienced in academia, moves pretty fast. Can you talk a little bit then about how you manage that, you as a person in academia manage that cognitive dissonance, or that colonial dissonance, and what you might do as on that healing journey?
Yeah. Well, it's never an easy path, and you know, there's different things that come up maybe every week, that where there's certain questions about what my principles that guide me and my family, and thinking through different things. I was thinking about there's a book called, I think it's called The Slow Academic, and I think I've been reading it for like 7 years, so I've slowly been reading it.
That's
But thinking through the pace of academia, but then also I think as Indigenous peoples in my generation, you know, there was different addictions that people in my family have dealt with. But one of the things that I don't think we've talked about enough is workaholism. And I think that is esteemed as something that is valued, and we can think of all the ways that we put up uh, those of us that struggle with workaholism as a, and sometimes that busyness can be a way, an unhealthy way to not deal with that colonial dissonance and intergenerational aspects of residential schools and different things. And so thinking through, yeah, what are ways to even think through the pace of life that is so easy to do and so seen and esteemed by others, but realizing that that isn't the balance that teachings within my own worldview talk about. And so what are ways to live in a more balanced way inside myself and inside my family, but also then we can think of all those relationships we have, and yeah, it's that's an area that doesn't come easy to me.
You are not alone in that world. Both Stephanie and I, when we have worked closely with organizations and school districts and others, speak to that same thing. Are there ways that you can find in your day to go slower? And oftentimes it's the commute in the morning, right? It would be half an hour for me to go to work. And so oftentimes it's that quiet time in the morning or the quiet time when you're coming home. And one of our aunties, Joan Brown, along the way has taught us if we start with gratitude, then it's easier after that. So slowing that pace to start with gratitude for land and language, and grateful that you're still here to do the good work that you're doing. So yeah, oftentimes we've asked our colleagues who are working 1,000 miles an hour, can they find a way to slow down thinking, slow down the day? But you know what that pace gets like. So
question in the chat there, Ted.
yeah, I see. It's always
good one.
always a great question near the end to talk about extractive capitalism throughout the world. And yeah, so the question from Tara is, what an incredible talk. Thank you. I'm wondering, how do we collectively get out of the grip that extractive capitalism has throughout the world to trade and exchange that is mutually beneficial and respectful? Something that Indigenous communities have had to deal with forever. Right? So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I talk about in the book about yeah, extractive capitalism and different extractive resources, and how the impacts for also we can think about how that impacts the availability of different options of livelihood. And so, you know, in Treaty 6, for example, it would be very hard to live a fully subsistence lifestyle for a community because of the impacts of the economics that have happened around reserves, let alone the whole treaty territory. And so thinking so that those extractive economies also take away options for different types of economic systems to take place. And yet there is still these systems that happen. And one perhaps question that has come from people that have read the book is about scope. So I talk about trade. I give some different examples, I think in chapter 10 of different case studies of ways that people are doing this, but then they talk about scope. And then that is where, and scale. And that's where that I think those trade networks are so important. And so thinking about those local systems that we have, those local food sources that we have. And I think on the West Coast, you're doing a better job of it than here in Edmonton, really reinvigorating different practices. But then also thinking about how we do trade with each other and trading knowledges and trading different, let's say, different seeds or different, all of those different things, and reinvigorating those Indigenous trade practices are one really exciting way that I think we could do more.
One of the things that you mentioned in here that resonated with me, and partly in answer to Tara's question too, is one of the frameworks that was gifted to the Nanaimo public schools was around Syeyutsus, meaning our friends or colleagues working together to do something. But it starts with land, and thinking of land as a relative rather than a commodity to pull things out of. And it's changed me along the way too, of thinking of land as relative and getting more involved in language, Hokkaido language learning, so that I can have that conversation with land and listen a little better. But you mentioned that in here too about land, living off the land is different than living with the land. And so maybe that's helpful too, Tara, around your question. If we can start to think of land as relative, that might help us think at least twice before we dig in and take from land, and start to be more reciprocal in nature and about that relationship.
Yeah. And Elmer Ghostkeeper wrote a book called Spirit Gifting, and he talked in that about this transition he had and his community had when he brought an oil and gas project to his community, and how it shifted his worldview from living with the land to a worldview of living off the land. And so thinking through, then he talks about in the book this shift of thinking what all those implications for of that are. And so, yeah, I think it is, and how we can develop those relationships with our relatives, including relationships with the land, that's something we don't need anyone's permission to do.
No.
And we can go through that journey in the mind and in the body to do those things, and those knowledges and teachings in different Indigenous nations still exist, and that it's so amazing when different Indigenous peoples choose to gift that knowledge to others. So, for example, in AWN, the elder that asked us to do the course and partner with them, she had felt it was her obligation to teach Indigenous and non-Indigenous students the skills to be able to do hide tanning. And she had to, it was her obligation to do that. And so it was really beautiful to see those teachings and that sharing of Indigenous knowledges.
Dr. Shalene, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank all of our guests too who came on and asked questions. It's a challenge in the face of the capitalist system around us, but always shaking that foundation, bringing back Indigenous ways of thinking about the world, different economic systems and governance systems, certainly will give us an avenue through all of that. We thank you for writing this, Upholding Indigenous Economic Relations. The voice of ancestors in there came through clear. It was apparent it was a very personal journey. And so I thank you on behalf of all of us here for joining us and sharing that with us. It's up.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be invited.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.